CAIRUL is also an active assessor for accreditation of engineering programs under the Board of Engineers Malaysia. The Malaysian Qualifications Agency published their guidelines to good practices on microcredentials in July 2020, and Professor CAIRUL will tell us about the journey to produce those guidelines, which I think will be really fascinating for us in our work in Scotland and certainly elsewhere. We're also going to be joined in our second presentation by Marisita Ismail, Head of Learning Services, Southeast Asia, Open Learning, and she's based in Kuala Lumpur. Marisita currently leads the Learning Services team in Malaysia and Southeast Asia at Open Learning, with a focus on transforming on-campus and distance education into great learning, social and active and engaging. As a background in technology, she was responsible for the strategic planning of e-learning developments at several higher education learning institutions in Malaysia. She also finds fulfillment in providing solutions for organisations focused on delivering education, and she's conducted numerous sessions covering all aspects of educational technology, from designing engaging online courses and engaging online activities to creating online learning communities. I'm very much looking forward to Marisita's contribution to this discussion. And finally, last but not least, we're joined by Professor Jonathan Powles, Vice Principal Learning, Teaching and Students, University of the West of Scotland. Jonathan is an Australian, as you will hear when he starts to talk to us, and he has had an academic career in Australia and the UK with a focus on academic innovation, learning and teaching at several universities in Australia and the UK. Jonathan joined UWS in August 2020, moving from the University of New England in Australia, where he held the post of Pro Vice Chancellor Academic Innovation. Originally a music academic, so we might get a little bit of a song later on, Jonathan has had responsibility for strategic programs for academic innovation, learning technology, curriculum design, institution-wide educational change, and student success. He's currently the Vice Principal Learning, Teaching and Students at the University of the West of Scotland. When Jonathan joined the Scottish sector, we very much wanted him to work with us, and now Jonathan is the chair of the Scottish Tertiary Education Network for Microcredentials, and this is providing a forum for discussion with a wide variety of stakeholders across Scotland. Jonathan's going to give us his perspectives of microcredentials from Australia based on his experience, and talk to us about what we're currently doing in Scotland. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Professor CAIRUL to start his presentation for 10 minutes, and then we will go to Marisita and then to Jonathan. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, Deborah. Hope everyone can hear me. Good morning to our colleagues in Scotland and also in UK. And good afternoon to my fellow colleague in Kuala Lumpur. So I'm very thrilled to be sharing this with you, with all of you. So I'm going to share on what we have so far with regards to microcredentials from the policy point of view. And this is part of our journey, which is hopefully by the end of this year, we will have a comprehensive guidelines to microcredentials implementations in the country. Hope everyone can see the slide. Okay, so our framework, basically in Malaysia, we have the National Qualifications Framework, and MQA is also the custodian of this framework. So, I mean, this is very, very, very important to us because as the agency who is in charge of quality assurance, we are also in charge of the qualifications framework. So it makes our job easier when we come to any policies related to anything to do with quality assurance and also higher education. And the current framework, which is basically revised in 2018, also incorporates the potential of having partial qualifications, which in this case also caters for the likes of microcredentials. So if you're wondering why we don't, our framework is basically already supportive of the framework itself to cover microcredentials. And this is basically the framework. And you can see the pillar on the right. There is also the important pillar on lifelong learning, where we have the recognition of prior learning. Why is this important is basically because later on, I will explain about the pathway of microcredential learners to enter an academic program through the route of appel. Yeah. And the journey itself on the micro-credentials started as early as 2018. As I said earlier, the framework itself is already supporting of that. And the framework was actually revised in 2018. So with that in mind, we actually had the first phase of the so-called the policy document, which we call as the guidelines to good practices. Okay, the first phase was in 2019, where in this phase, actually what we did was we explained in detail what is microcredential and what are the characters of microcredentials and how the existing courses can be actually treated as microcredentials and actually used as form of credit transfer to an existing program. So at this point of time, we did not touch too much about unbundling because that was in the second phase. So this is just the introductory, but the importance of this guideline is to actually to ensure that everyone gets the idea, of what microcredential is and the potential of microcredential, and using the existing platforms that we had at the point of time, which was MOOCs, credit transfer through MOOCs, and also Appel C. Appel C is basically credit transfer through prior learning. So there are additional assessments that has to be done prior to the so-called credentials to be accepted as part of the credit transfer. But at least it is something to start off with. And it's good that we leverage on existing platforms, existing policies, so that it is not something that we have totally developed from scratch. So, and then when we go to the second phase, this is the important phase in which this, once we actually publish this in 2020, it actually cancels out the first phase guidelines. So it actually supersedes the first phase guideline. This is actually launched in August 2020. And we actually elaborated on the micro-credentials leading to formal academic qualifications. And then it also encompasses the part that we allow micro-credentials to be originated from existing academic programs through unbundling and unpacking of these programs. So the detailed part about that is actually detailed out or explained in this document. And the document also touches about the so-called standalone micro-credential, which are micro-credentials that are offered beyond the academic programs. They are offered as short courses, for example. So there are potential of these so-called standalone micro-credentials to also be accepted as part of credit transfer. But this is actually not explained in detail in this particular second phase, but rather it's put on to the third phase, which we are now developing and in the midst of finalizing the guidelines. So the third phase actually is actually to complete the entire so-called policy document. It actually explains about how standalone micro-credentials, existing maybe perhaps short courses can be converted into micro-credentials, and then how to verify them and how, what is the minimum unit number in terms of credit hours, in terms of student learning time or learners learning time and so on. So these are actually encompasses or it's actually explained inside the third phase of this document. So, and then we'll continue with the existing guidelines, which is the one that we released in 2020. So in this particular document, as I explained earlier, we defined the types of micro-credentials, where we had the micro-credentials which are unbundled from academic programs, and standalone micro-credentials which are not originated from accredited academic programs. So the ones that are extensively explained in this document are related to the unbundling of academic, the ones originated from unbundling of academic programs. These are basically micro-credentials which we have already certified in terms or recognized through the accreditation program itself. So the institutions of higher learning or providers needs to only notify MQA their intention of offering micro-credentials which are unbundled from academic programs. And there is no assessments required unless the mode of delivery is different. For example, the original program was endorsed as a face-to-face conventional program, but the micro-credential was to be offered as an ODL or open and distance start learning, then perhaps there is a small assessment that needs to take place. But if the original endorsement for the program is actually ODL and offering of the micro-credential is also in ODL form, then the institution or the provider needs only to inform MQA of their intention. So, and then this is very important because it relates to the principles of good micro-credentials. When we talk about the unbundling micro-credentials, they have all this already in place because all these characters, principles are also required in terms of an academic program as a whole. So the academic programs in Malaysia has to be outcome-based. Of course, when we talk about micro-credential, it has to be more personalized. Industry-driven is also actually required from an academic program itself. Secure and shareable is maybe something that is additional. Of course, the credentials has to be secure and shareable, authenticated and shared online with others. And transparency is also very, very important, especially in between the learners and also the providers. And then the quality assurance of the micro-credentials, which are also in our guidelines, is actually as listed here. And it's also very much similar to the processes that we conduct for the accreditation program of our academic programs as well. Requires the market analysis and so on. So I think this is very much in line with our normal processes when we deal with academic program accreditation. And all of this will lead to the MQA quality mark, which is a trusted brand here in Malaysia. And one important thing that I need to highlight is that all providers of micro-credentials have to issue this micro-credential statement or MMS, which actually indicates the important information with regards to the micro-credentials itself. With, for example, it should have the credit hours, the learning time, the level of the course, whether it's a level of bachelor, master's, and so on. And also the mode of study, whether it's conventional, distance learning, and so on. And at the moment, after we launched our guidelines to good practices in 2020, we have already had 11,000 plus credentials being registered with MQA. As I said earlier, these are originated from unbundling of accredited programs. So they just need to notify MQA, and this is what we have received so far. So we had this close to 12,000 coming from 648 programs from all levels, from certificate level 3 all the way to level 8, which is on the doctorate level. And it involves 67 higher education providers throughout the country. Okay, and the way forward for us is, as I said earlier, we want to enhance our guidelines to also incorporate the standalone micro-credentials, which can be a huge market out there because it also includes all the so-called short courses out there. So how can these be turned into micro-credentials? So this is the very important point that we want to highlight in the GGP. So it has to be verified by MQA and has to be connected to the MQF. So it also has to be all these points needs to also be addressed. And the also important point that we also want to highlight here is the pathway for learners who have actually accumulated a substantial amount of micro-credentials. And if they want to actually continue their studies and actually be awarded with a qualification, then they have a separate route or an alternative route they can also use with regards to APEL M, which is the accreditation of prior experiential learning micro-credential. So this is a special pathway for learners who have perhaps not fulfilled the entry requirement to that particular academic program, but they have accumulated enough micro-credentials to show that they can actually cope with the program itself. So they can actually choose this pathway, and this is part of the policy that we are also building and also establishing together with the last part of the GGP. And on the GGP of the standalone, I think the most important point that I want to highlight is that we need to have this proper verification mechanism. And this verification mechanism needs to be actually conducted by these established verification centers that needs to be actually established throughout the country. Because if we rely solely on MQA, this I think will be task too much for us, because we have maybe thousands or maybe hundreds of thousands of programs out there, short courses out there that can be turned into micro-credentials. So we need to have a proper verification center, and this is part of the the policy that we are building within this GGP that we are hoping by the end of September we can publish this to the public. And we also are very ambitious. We also want to actually have this learners credit depository as part of the forward thinking of MQA. So this can also be an alternative. Can be a repository for learners. They can actually deposit their credits here, and we can actually generate a transcript that is actually endorsed by MQA. And of course, this is not solely the jurisdiction of MQA. This is very open, but I think MQA is also very interested to be a part of this learners credit depository system. And these are maybe just a diagram to show that the potential of micro-credentials and how people out there can actually accumulate credentials and eventually get a qualification, for example, a bachelor's degree and so on. So they can actually come up and shop around credentials from different institutions, different providers, and accumulate them and be able to graduate once they fulfill the minimum graduating criteria or credit hours requirement. And the challenges, I think, generally we need to get the institutions and the providers to be ready. I think this is something that everyone is looking forward to, and there are, of course, a lot of things that we need to do once we establish the guidelines later on, and how we can actually get these institutions and also providers to actually offer more micro-credentials and more maybe interesting micro-credentials to the learners out there. Okay, I think that's all from me. Thank you very much. If you have any questions that I cannot answer today, then you can always text me. This is my email address. Thank you very much. And back to you, Deborah.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Khairul. I think there's going to be quite a lot of questions. I know there'll certainly be some from Professor Piles on some of the things that you've talked about there when we come to the discussion, and I'll keep my questions too. But thank you so much for that. Really fascinating to see how far you've developed and what some of those challenges are, and just to think about some of the parallels with our situation in Scotland. So I think there will be questions. I'll move on now to Marcita, if you would like to start sharing your screen and doing your presentation. Thank you.
Hi, Deborah. Okay, sure. Let me share my screen. Okay. So I think my screen is shared. Is it shared already, Deborah?
It's shared. I think we just have to put it on slideshow.
Hold on. Sorry.
This is always the hardest part of webinars, isn't it? You've done all this amazing research, difficult work across all these years, but the screen sharing is the thing that's just tricky. So we can't see your screen anymore, Marcita. Oh, I think it's starting now.
Oh, okay. I think it's on slideshow mode now, right?
That's it, just loading, I think now. That's it.
Okay.
Thank
All
you.
right. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Deborah. And hello, everyone. Good morning. And good morning to all the panelists, and also good evening, Prof. Cairo. And thank you, Deborah, for the introduction earlier. I'm really happy to be part of this discussion today. I think it's really amazing that we all get to gather here, tuning in from various locations. And thank you for the opportunity to share our work and our experience in the microcredential space. I think specifically for today, I'll be sharing more about the OpenCreds microcredential framework and the criteria already aligned, stated in the framework, as well as the technology aspect that supports the framework, as well as the development of microcredentials. So as a learning designer myself, I think at Open Learning, we are involved in a lot of different online courses and development of online courses, as well as micro-credential courses. Specifically, we are involved in providing learning design and support for the education providers. And so at Open Learning, we try to build the education perspective into the platform itself, in a sense that the technology is built around to deliver this the style of education that provides courses that are collaborative and active and also socially constructive. So I think we're really focused in providing education and training providers a platform to build and deliver transformative and really amazing courses. So this is where OpenCreds framework comes in, and it's actually one of our initiative in supporting providers in offering courses that meet the needs of the industry, of the employers, as well as the learners, or the lifelong learners, and also in preparing all of us for the future of continuous and lifelong learning, and also alternative pathways. So just a brief introduction to why we started this journey is we noticed that over the years, there's been a lot of talk around micro-credentials, short courses. And when we first started working on the framework, some of the questions that we thought about would be, what are micro-credentials? How different is it from a conventional program? How large or how small can it be? And also the recognition of these micro-credentials. And what are the criteria that would define these courses as high quality courses? And we do get these questions as well, and we didn't really have the answers to a lot of it. So we wanted to set out to try and come up with a framework that actually help everyone to sort of speak a common language around micro-credentials. And I think that's really what the OpenCreds is about, because I think it's just trying to provide more guidance and the best way to deliver micro-credentials. And besides that, we wanted to do it in such a way that we will have a common name for the framework, and like a general approach and standard, and also at the same time ensuring that any country that support the framework or apply the framework, it will still suit the country and the education providers that's using it. So when we are developing the framework, we try to think about how can we create the framework that will support not only our Australian providers, but also Malaysian providers and other education providers around the world. And I think the bigger dream for all of us here today would be to, in the long run, how can we support how can we enable recognition and exchange, and hopefully some credit transfer at some point in the future, even between different countries. So when we started the journey, I won't go into detail here, but what I wanted to point out is that we've consulted and engaged with various organizations and education providers through the process of developing the framework. And at the moment, we are supportive of education providers when they are developing their open creds or any type of micro credentials. And we're thinking of how can we expand this globally. But when we talk about expanding it globally, what we're actually thinking about is how can we make those courses more global? So for example, we've had education partners in South Africa and in Singapore implementing the framework that we developed in Malaysia, and they are building their micro-credentials and offering these micro-credentials globally to students or working professionals in Malaysia or in Australia, in Singapore, even in anywhere from around the world. And these learners who are looking at taking this course will be able to do that and then start working towards getting credit from the institution. So we're trying to really look at enabling people from other countries to have educational experience that could lead towards credit in another country eventually. So even though the framework is there, but we're still improving and iterating it. And just mid of April this year, our counterpart in Australia have released version 2 of the Open Creds framework, and to bring it into alignment with the latest Australian National Microcredentials framework, which I think was published in March this year. So I think this is really exciting because as we collect more feedback, as the framework is being used, and we may release a new version over time as well. And if we look at the core of the framework, it's really focused on supporting interoperability between all types of education. This could be from a TVET sector to professional development sector or higher education sector. And we want to make sure that it's across the lifelong learning ecosystem, because I think this is really important because a lot of education or a lot of training happens throughout our lifetime, and not all of it is delivered by a university or a college. It could be delivered by industry associations, by employers, by government agencies. And so we wanted to make sure that the framework can actually support all of these different providers and provide interoperability and some form of commonalities between all of these providers. And at the same time, we've also worked to make sure that the framework is adapted to align it with MQA's guideline to good practices that was mentioned by Prof. Cairo earlier. And this was really important for us because a lot of our education partners in Malaysia would aim for their micro-credentials to be aligned with the GGP as well. So we wanted to make sure that the Open Creds framework is consistent and also is simple to apply or to be implemented, and to make sure that it doesn't replace the guideline is an approach to implement the guideline. So again, as we have more information or we have more guidance from our regulators, from our policymakers, we will still adapt and make the changes throughout the years. And also, I think it means that when new things are happening, we're also trying to make sure that the Open Creds framework is always up to date and always supporting the latest approach. And I think the best part is that the framework itself is designed to assist education providers, any type of education providers, to be more innovative and also to be more adaptable to the industry. So if we look at the Open Creds framework itself, there's actually different types of Open Creds, and one of those is actually industry aligned. So our idea is to make sure that the courses or the micro-credential courses are always relevant to the industry. So just going to look at the different types of Open Creds here that you can see. So the chart may look a bit confusing or complicated, but actually the idea is that there's actually 3 different types of Open Creds here that you can see. There's TVET, Professional Learning and Higher Education Open Cred. And also what we're trying to show here is that there's possibility for interoperability between the Open Creds. And of course, this depends on the provider that determines what type of Open Cred the provider can offer. For example, a TVET provider might not be able to offer a higher education Open Cred, but a TVET Open Cred can actually lead towards a credit at a higher education provider. And of course, all of this is still to be determined by the education provider themselves. But on top of that, open credits can also stand alone. They don't actually have to provide a formal credit. The idea is that the open credit should have a lot of values in upskilling and also in reskilling perspective. And yeah, so besides that, we also have the open credits can also be classified into 3 classifications. There's pathway, credit bearing, as well as industry recognized open credits. And we can see that the pathway one is the one that's aligned to a formal qualification, and it should provide a clear understanding of the level of achievement upon completion of the open credit, and it should lead to a formal qualification. So it's like a pathway into a qualification. So it could be the first course or a prerequisite course, or it could be a course that's recognized under the RPL, under recognition of prior learning or other methods. But eventually it leads to an accredited qualification. So the second one is the one that all of us, I think, are more familiar with. That's the credit bearing open credits. Which is actually part of a qualification, the unbundled type of open credits that Prof. Cairo have mentioned earlier as well. And the third type is the industry recognized. So it could be offered by industry association, accrediting body. So this could be a course that's recognized for CPD points, and it could meet the needs of professional development in particular sectors like nursing or teaching. And yeah, so I think this is actually where there's a lot of the professional learning and lifelong learning takes place at the moment, at least here in Malaysia. But I think having these 3 types means that you could possibly have some interaction or some interoperability between the different types of open credits. And the next criteria that we've also developed into the framework is in terms of how long a micro-credential is. And I think that was not so easy for us to determine. So we've analyzed a vast majority of types of courses, and from different sectors, from certificates to diplomas to TVET sector courses, CPD courses. And we worked out on what's the average length of these different types of courses and clustered them into different learning hours. So we came up with these levels or sizes based on the learning hours. And how we define learning hours is in terms of the amount of time that a beginner or someone who doesn't have any prior knowledge of that topic will need to take, or is expected to take, to achieve the outcome set in the course. So, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that all the hours need to be spent on the platform if it's an online course. And this could be like activities or projects that the learners might be doing on their own time, or they could also include work experience or consultation work or anything that's needed to make sure the outcomes are achieved. So basically, it's how long will someone need to gain the experience necessary and do all the work required to meet the outcomes. And we've clustered them into these 7 levels. And the minimum is 4 hours, which is closer to a short or professional learning session here in Malaysia. And similar to attending a half-day workshop or conference. And 160 hours is aligned to a 4-credit course in the Malaysian University degree. And the next criteria, which is the last one that I'm going to share about, is the evidence of learning. And I think this is a criteria that I really like to discuss about, because I believe it's a criteria that make the framework really unique. As part of this criteria, it requires each open credit, there need to be an evidence of learning by individual learners. So, and this is where I think the learning design part comes in, because when we think of online courses or any lifelong learning courses, especially when they are online, and a lot of times when we go online, we start doing a course by maybe watching a video and then maybe later do a quiz at the end. And sometimes that's all there is to the online course. So I think the challenge here when we are developing micro-credentials is when the learner go to an employer, or when they want to use these badges and certificates to apply for a university course. Really hard for the employer or the university to know what they have actually learned in the course. And they could show maybe a CV with 10 certificates or 10 badges, but where's the evidence of actually acquiring those knowledge? So this is, so the question comes down to what did the learners actually do to get those certificates? And if all they did was quizzes, I think there's a lot of ways for a learner to get 100% in an online quiz. So what we've done is that we've specified that OpenCred needs to have some form of open-ended activities or projects that will generate unique learning evidence for each of the students that complete those OpenCreds. And what that means is that if there's a project or an activity that every student who does that project or activity has a slightly different artifact or slightly different work to showcase, and that unique piece of work goes into their portfolio. So this could be an addition to any quizzes or any exams or anything else that the education provider might want to run. But in addition to that, there need to be something where the students can really demonstrate their unique skills and capabilities that they've learned in this OpenCred. So I think this is a key part of the framework. And the best part is that the platform supports this type of courses. So in the Open Learning platform, we can automatically generate the portfolios of learning for every student in the course. So everyone who goes through any course on the platform will have a portfolio and that showcase their evidence of learning. And they can actually share this with their potential employers.
Marcita, thank you so much. Can I stop you there just so we have time for Jonathan and a little bit of discussion at the end? I would love to just let you talk more about that, but I know there's lots of interest in the chat, but if I could just move on just for the moment, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, no worries, because in terms of the criteria, I think that's about it. And if there's any other questions about the rest of the frame and any other questions about the framework, then we can always discuss later as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And Jonathan, I'm going to pass over to you to share now. Thank you.
Thanks, Deborah. Can you see? Can you see my screen?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, it's just interesting reflecting on my Australian colleagues. I'm not sure how many people in the UK understand the scale of the Malaysian system. It's a fascinating. There are 1.4 million students in higher education in Malaysia. More than 100,000 of those are international students, inbound international students. Malaysian government, as you can see, has invested very strategically in focusing on higher education as one of its significant drivers of its economy. And I think you can see the outcomes and the scale and the innovation. It's quite exciting. But I'm not sure how aware UK colleagues all are. We're very conscious of it in Australia. So look, I'm delighted to be here. I'll go as quickly as I can. As Deborah said, I'm Australian. I might have to cut the singing, unfortunately. What I wanted to do is to just rattle through the Australian perspective and then pick up right at the end on what both the Malaysian experience and the Australian experience might offer for Scotland. So very quickly, I need to move my slides forward somehow. Oh, there we go. All right. One of the things that's plagued movement forwards in micro-credentials, I think in a lot of places, is understanding what it is that we're talking about. It's quite hard to pin down what we mean by micro-credentials, and actually possibly the most useful way of thinking through that is to understand that micro-credentials really are a negative definition. What the rise of us talking about micro-credentials really reflects, in the view of some significant scholars, in particular the one I've got there are Australian scholars, what it reflects is actual shortcomings of our traditional qualifications in an emerging world in which lifelong learning is increasingly important. So micro-credentials themselves are not the issue. What they reveal are shortcomings with what we have currently, and I'll come back to that at the end. I think that's important to bear in mind when we think about what it is that we need to do, because it's not just about inventing a bunch of new stuff, it is potentially about interrogating what we currently offer. Beverly Oliver, who is an Australian former Deputy Vice Chancellor of Education at the University of Deakin, one of the most innovative thinkers around microcredentials in Australia, and chaired the group that put together the recently published National Microcredentials Framework in Australia. So Beverly is having retired from the position as a DVC, has made it her mission to make these things work in Australia. In an article in 2019, I think she really helpfully identified what it is that students are looking for in microcredentials that distinguish them from our traditional degree offerings. They need to be lower cost. They need to involve less investment of students. And we're not just talking about fees here. We're talking about time, and we're talking about the life cost of learning. And so what microcredentials, if designed properly, should offer is the ability to study with lower investment, lower risk. They need to be transferable, and therefore be part of some form of portfolio approach to lifelong learning, which we haven't quite articulated yet, I don't think, in any country. I like the word portmanteau approach to learning, the ability to sort of collect multiple things end on. They are more outcomes driven and industry focused. They capture experiential or prior learning more easily than our traditional models. And they're more easily completed, flexible and online mode. Now that's my summary of Beverly's article from 2019. Now, interestingly, as I said, Beverly Oliver chaired the group that has just published March 2022, the Australian National Microcredential Framework, and they've got a set of principles around the provision of microcredentials in Australia, and you'll see that they reflect many of those principles that inform Beverly's analysis. They need to be outcomes based. They need to you need to very clearly see what it is that it's the learning that's being undertaken and measured. They do have to be driven by industry need. They do have to support that notion of lifelong learning. I'll come back to that in some reflections on funding at the end. Critically, and I think it informs everything that the three speakers today are saying, we need to understand what we're getting for our money. We need to understand what the student has achieved. There needs to be one of the issues with short courses currently is they're a little bit opaque. If someone gets a certificate because they've done something somewhere, it doesn't tell us in terms of an SEQF level or in terms of an AQF level in Australia's case, and in terms of a volume of learning and in terms of a credit value, if they are a microcredential that holds a credit value. The ability to understand what the student has learned is essential to the ability for the microcredentials to be stackable and transferable. And so I think it's really interesting, reflecting on that microcredential hub in Malaysia, and as part of the National Microcredential Framework document that was published in Australia, there is a proposal to form a microcredential marketplace. So a similar sort of notion of a central clearinghouse where the quality, volume, and outcomes of microcredentials are recorded and exchanged. So part of that transparent nature is the defined volume of learning. In Australia, we're defining microcredentials as being any learning from 1 hour up to the minimum volume of learning of an award at that AQF level. So at let's say postgraduate, let's talk about postgraduate certificate. That in Australia is a minimum volume of learning of 600 hours. So a microcredential at that level in the AQF, I can't remember now, it's been a while, it would be level 11 in Scotland. I think it's 8 in Australia. The critical point is that a microcredential would be any amount of learning between 1 and 599 hours. This issue of credit ratedness is really important. And I think I'll move on now very quickly. In Australia, there are quite clearly 2 use cases for microcredentials that emerge, that both of which reflect this notion of outcomes-based flexible lifelong learning. The first is credit-based, so capture a particular skill or a particular capability that a student has done after a certain number of learning hours, and essentially it's like a mini degree or a mini slice of a degree. The one I've got there is the Deakin Professional Practice Credentials. Where they're interesting is they don't necessarily involve any formal learning. They can be entirely RPL based, but nevertheless, the volume of your learning, the level in terms of the AQF of your learning, and the level of the outcomes are captured through a portfolio, and then you get the award. So that's one type of credit-based micro-credential that's in currency in Australia. Another is what is referred to as, so there's no the digital badge, if you like, reflects particular mastery to a particular level that you've achieved as part of some normal program of study. So undergraduates graduating from Deakin have the opportunity to reflect their particular what they call hallmarks around things like problem solving or critical thinking or global citizenship, if they've actually demonstrated that they've met the learning outcomes, but there's no additional credit. Both of those things reflect some of the characteristics and principles that inhabit micro-credentials, but they're not the same. I'm just going to pause. I'm nearly finished, but I want to reflect on something that's really important. Despite Australia's energy and commitment to micro-credentials, I would say that Australia has so far failed to genuinely realise the value of micro-credentials in a genuine lifelong learning framework. And I think a lot of that comes down to funding, as so many things do. So just quick briefing on funding in Australia. In Australia, it's a bit like sort of halfway between Scotland and England. For undergraduate, the government pays on average about half of the student's fees. The student pays the rest in an income contingent deferred loan. For postgrad, it's all a loan, so the student pays the full cost of the fees. Back in 2008, they decoupled funding from institutions and placed it with students. So a student can move around from institution to institution and their funding goes with them. It's a really significant component of any successful lifelong learning operation. And it's quite different from what happens in Scotland, where it is the institution that receives the place rather than the student that receives the funding. There is, however, that because they, as part of the Bradley Review, the notion of caps or control places was taken away in Australia in 2008, or gradually after 2008. There's high levels of competition between institutions in Australia, as there is in England. And a really critical thing that still causes me to go slightly cross-eyed in Scotland, the funding is based on load, not years. So you're basically, as an Australian student, you're funded based on the number of modules that you do, the total load that you do. No one particularly cares whether you're completing a full load in the course of a year. The notion of a full-time student is actually, if you think about it, a little bit antithetical to the notion of lifelong learning. If what we are accepting is that the modern economy, the modern cultural, political, and economic environments require the population to continually refresh their learning, the notion that one was going to study full-time for 4 years, complete a degree, and then finish one's education, which is actually the model on which our funding mechanisms are based, is no longer fit for purpose. And Australia has moved on from that. And Australia, you get funded simply on the number of modules that you're attempting, and the number of modules you can attempt at any one point in time is entirely up to the student. There's really no difference between a part-time and a full-time student, except that a full-time student is attempting the maximum number of modules that anyone can manage at a time. So my point here, and this is my second last slide, there's a structural contradiction in the Australian model. We have an educational and policy model that is really fit for purpose in terms of transportable, low-cost, flexible, lifelong learning. You can take little bits of learning from institution to institution. The funding will permit that. But the economic model, the way in which the higher education sector is constructed, really means that institutions are better rewarded if they grab students and keep them for as long as possible. And that's why we haven't had any success in Australia in really vast numbers of micro-credentials or micro-credential enrollments, because institutions get more for their buck if they actually keep the student enrolled in not in a 6-week postgraduate short course, but if they can somehow cash that student into a master's student. And that comes through the essentially competitive model. So last slide, lessons for Scotland. We need to have some standardized definitions. We need to know what it is that we're talking about and underwrite those centrally through a national quality framework for micro-credentials. I think we are ideally sized for our own version of the Malaysian hub or the Australian marketplace to work. Of the title suggested, I like the notion of the Scottish Microcredential Cooperative, but a clearinghouse for microcredentials offered by all institutions to allow students to dip into and out of those across the sector. I think the SFC really seriously needs to look at the funding model, which is significantly predicated on full-time students progressing after a year of full-time study to the next year. That is actually structurally counter to the notion of lifelong learning. And I think if anything comes out of the work that we're doing in the network, it will be some recommendations for the SFC around what it can do around part-time and flexible funding approaches. But it's not just about unbundling our structures, it's about unbundling our thinking. I mean, at UWS are constantly running into people who will talk about level 9, and all of what they are thinking about is a third-year student 3 years after leaving school. And if you think about it, you know, they finish S6 at school, they're 17 or 18, and then they go into level 7, 8, 9. Actually, that's not what our students are, and that's certainly not what a lifelong learning model looks like. Having said those things, if we can actually address some of those issues that have been addressed, as you've seen in the Australian and the Malaysian higher education environments. So it's not impossible. There are countries with huge scale of much more flexible approaches. I think Scotland would very rapidly move to the forefront, because I think just because of the size of our sector, we've got a very coordinated further education sector. We've got quite a coordinated and cooperative higher education sector with a central approach to quality assurance. And we, because of our funding models, we've got relatively lower levels of competition than either in Australia or in England. If you know, and I think, as I said earlier, it's that competition that's militating against good lifelong learning practices. I think Scotland could really steal a march on the rest of the world if we decided to invest in this, and it would be relatively simple. It's just about, as I say, unbundling our thinking, and Scotland could be at the cutting edge. So that's me. There's some references. Really keen in the small time we have left to field any questions.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. I like finishing on a high point and an ambitious note, and I'm glad you're chairing the Scottish tertiary network for microcredentials, and you can just get that done for us. So that's fantastic. We're obviously just 2 minutes till 11, so we really are at time. However, I would like to suggest for those of you that can stay that we continue on maybe for 10 minutes if we can, just to take some questions. I know that some of you will have other meetings, and please do feel free to go to them, but if you would like to stay just to have a little bit of conversation, then please do so. So I guess I'd like to open up the floor to our speakers to talk to each other first of all, but also if anyone would like to pose a specific question in the chat. I know that the question for me was kind of really round about Jonathan's last slide. So, okay, so what does that mean for Scotland, and what can we do that's most effective in the Scottish sector? So I'll maybe just open to our speakers to just discuss what they were talking about, and how we can learn from some of what we've heard about Malaysia, and how we can still adopt a kind of unique approach that might put Scotland at the forefront, as Jonathan says. Jonathan?
I'll just try and not to say more, but to pick up on what Sheila Dunn has said, we have a very flexible qualification framework. I agree. I think our framework is fine. This is the point I was trying to make, and I'm sorry if I was a bit sort of flailing around with a blunt object, not intending to. We've got a very flexible framework, but I don't think either. Well, our funding models or the ways in which they are applied at universities, and even after 2 years here, I can't quite tease out what parts of our practice rest with the SFC models and what parts of our practice just rest in our cultural conservatism as a sector around how students should progress, how they should be funded. Everyone tells me it's extremely difficult to be a part-time student in Scotland. I can't quite work out why it's so hard. What I do know is that in the UK in general, part-time study and lifelong study has plateaued in a way that is completely the opposite of what's happening in Australia, in Malaysia, in the UK, in the USA and in Canada, where part-time postgraduate study is the absolute growth area. So I think we do need to look at our funding models, but our qualification model is great.
I think to also highlight about the main purpose of having this micro-credentials. It's actually a part of flexible education, and it's actually, we call it as a MAME, which is a multiple entry, multiple exit system, which the students and learners can actually go in whenever they are ready. They can actually work and then accumulate a small sum of money and then use that to get credentials. And this can, in a way, can move us away from the conventional way of, you know, the funding, which we talk about the sum, big sum of money. So the learners can be able to actually plan for themselves and be able to go in whenever they are ready. And this is the beauty, I think, of the system about micro-credentials. Thank you.
Professor Cairo, we've got a question in the chat that I wonder if you might want to reflect on. It's from John Kerr. So he's asked, I wonder how we achieve stackability from, oh, it's just disappeared up my chat and I've lost it. It's about how we achieve stackability from other providers. So, you know, maybe from industry at scale. So involving a huge amount of checking. And I know that that's your next challenge, is looking at those standard microcredentials that might not be provided from higher education.
Thank you very much. I think it's a very interesting question, and it's supposed to open up the minds of not only from the perspective of learners, but from the providers as well. So now we have a consortium of institutions, for example, who can design a program that can be actually accepted by both parties, or it can be a tri-party, it can be you know, multiple parties. So and they can also work together with the industry. So in which the providers of the so-called standalone microcredentials can also come in and chip in some of the modules. And this as a whole can be accepted as an award, maybe a joint award by some more than one institution. So I think this is part of the flexibility that we are proposing here in Malaysia, at least with our guidelines.
Thanks very much for that. Yeah. I'm also interested in the conversations in the chat about, you know, the Scottish aspect and the UK aspect and whether we can make it global. So we need to think very carefully about those things. And I wonder if any of our speakers have got any reflections on those kind of issues. Nobody's got the answer to that one. I think that's okay, but I think it's something that we do have to think about. Does anyone want to come in on that question?
Going back to the stackability, I think the policy here in Malaysia, we are still looking at the credit transfer policy. That is still very much important. And then when we talk about stackability, if it comes from separate multiple institutions, multiple providers, then perhaps it's also good that among the providers, you have to talk to each other. If we are not talking about a new program that is designed as what I explained earlier, existing programs, I think the program owners can talk to each other and actually be able to do you know, comparative study in between what they are offering. And with that, they can actually have a better understanding of whether that stackability, when it comes to allowance of the credentials as part of a credit transfer, whether that can be accepted or not. So that kind of homework can be done by respective providers who wish to actually maybe award the learners with qualification in the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I wonder whether, Jonathan, we maybe just end on reflecting back on your thinking about unbundling, or thinking about, you know, this is a third-year student, or this is the way we fund the provision. I might just let you have a bit of a discussion about that. It's come up in the chat. I think Mark mentioned that.
Thanks, Deborah. I did want to jump in on the Future for Scotland question, unless I checked whether there was anyone from UWS here. Because I have to say, I think it's a stark choice. I think I know that having spent 2 years in the management of a Scottish university, one of the things we keep asking the government for is more certainty about our funding stream, you know, 3-year funding models rather than 1-year funding models. And that's, yeah, that absolutely suits universities to have more monolithic approaches to the distribution of funds. What I'm arguing is that our students are actually benefited by the opposite. by more flexibility, by more granularity, by funding that follows the student on a module by module basis, it is, relatively speaking, a nightmare for universities because and deeply insecure for universities. But I think it's what our students need. I think it's what the Scottish students need, and potentially could attract additional students from outside of Scotland if we made it work. If we can allow a funding model that has students taking their learning from institution to institution as suits them. And I had a couple, an ideal world for UWS students would be one in which, I'll just speak about my own institution, in which one of our engineering students could dip into some further education, some automotive engineering learning at one of the local colleges, or a languages student at UWS might be studying Spanish, but goes and takes a module in Latin at St Andrews. That would be the ideal model for the students. It would be a nightmare for our institutions. And I actually think that it's time to shift the balance a little bit in favour of our students. And I think micro-credentials could be one of the things that help that along.
Thank you for that.
If I'm allowed to answer the question from Peter Evans about the what sort of guidance and support do students need to navigate a much more complex landscape of micro-credentials? So from Malaysia's perspective, from MQA's point of view, we will actually have another register, a register of the so-called certified credentials on top of our normal MQR. MQR is for programs. We will have another depository and a register for the micro-credentials. And the learners can actually go into that portal and be able to see what are the credentials which are actually verified and certified by MQA. I think that maybe the same concept can be also be implemented in Scotland, perhaps.
Thank you so much. Colleagues, I'm going to draw us to a close just by thanking our speakers. I think we've had an awful lot of food for thought this morning. Lots of good ideas that we want to take away and reflect on. Some really excellent comments in the chat. So thanks not only to our speakers, but to our participants, because I think your questions have really helped us in our thinking. This isn't the last of these discussions. You do have the presenters' emails. We will also share the slides and we will be in touch. And I would really like to, again, if you can come to the Enhancement Themes Conference and continue this discussion, I would be delighted to see you again. Thanks so much and enjoy the rest of your Monday, the evening for our colleagues in Malaysia and the rest of the day for mostly everyone else, I think. Thanks.